Alex, welcome to the Decision Making Studio podcast, formerly known as the All Things Risk podcast. This is an honor. So thank you very much for taking some time to chat with me and with my listeners.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation. It's great to hear of the interest in my work.
Alex, to start, I think people who are listening to this know who you are. And it's the day after two finals of a couple of big football competitions in the men's space, and you have written and done research on the effect of football tournaments and their results on share price indices. And I thought maybe we could start there. Let's just and commiserations for the England results. However, if we could maybe talk a little bit about your work in that space first, just to just take advantage of the moment and maybe think a little bit more broadly. And you mentioned this in your book, May Contain Lies. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that research and why you mention it in your book, May Contain Lies. So maybe we could just start there. What is it about the results of football finals that seem to affect share price indices? What's that all about? What's going on there?
Sure. Very happy to discuss that. So you might think, well, why did I even look at this wacky topic to begin with? Why do we care about the effect of football results on the stock market? And indeed, this was my PhD thesis at MIT. You might wonder, how did MIT award a PhD for such seemingly irrelevant research? But the question here is a highly relevant one, is what drives the stock market? Is it fundamentals, such as profits and dividends and inflation and unemployment? Or is it emotions? Because the people who trade stocks are human beings. They are affected by emotions. And before my work, there had been other papers which had tried to look at the effect of emotions on the stock market. And so what do they use as measures of emotions? Now, you can't look at something like an election result or a plane crash, or a pandemic. Because even though those things affect your emotions, they also have a direct economic impact. So if you view the stock market as going down in a lockdown, that could be nothing to do with mood. That's just because the lockdown is bad for the economy. So what other people did is they looked at things like clock changes, lunar cycles, sunshine, and whether they affected the stock market. And the problem here is that even though these studies got published in top peer-reviewed journals, is that it might be spurious correlation. It could just be lucky. And this is why it featured in my book, May Contain Lies, is the idea that even if the data is absolutely watertight, it could be a product of randomness. For example, if you wanted to show that weather affected the stock market, you could correlate the stock market with sunshine and snowfall and wind and temperature and rainfall and hail. And just one of them might happen to be significant because of luck. So if I want to show that mood affects the stock market, I want to convince people that I only ever looked at one measure rather than looking at tons and tons of different ones. And so this is why I looked at football results. As if you want to look at something which affects national mood, sports results are likely to be it. So there's a lot of psychological evidence that sports results have a huge effect on your mood. So when England lost to Argentina in the 1998 World Cup, heart attacks shot up over the next few days. So people died because their team lost. I've never seen anybody die because of the weather as directly. And similarly, in Canada, the Montreal Canadiens when then eliminated from the Stanley Cup, suicides go up. And while Canadians unfortunately kill themselves, Americans kill each other. So murders go up in a local city when the team is knocked out of the NFL playoffs. So these are things which have a large effect on your mood. And because there's a strong reason for why sports results affect mood, I thought it was reasonable to show that they affected the stock market. You contrast that with other variables like weather and lunar cycles. There, the effect on mood is much less clear. And therefore, if you found a result, it may well be.
It's fascinating. And you, when you presented this and you, in your book, May Contain Lies, you talk about the scrutiny that you got from CNN's Richard Quest, I believe it was, about, and this is during the 2014 World Cup, wasn't it? And he kind of pushed you on this because it does sound on the face of it, and it's headline grabbing finding, right? And we come across a lot of studies, and you mention a few that are very headline friendly. And so just wondering, what was it like when you had someone kind of pushing on the results of this research?
I actually thought it was not a problem at all. I'm very happy to have people push me and challenge me. Like, that is what research should be encouraging. And indeed, whenever you present a paper at an academic seminar, then people will ask questions about it, not to try to poke holes and to embarrass you, but this is how your papers improve, is by getting some critical feedback. And so when Richard Quest was interviewing me, okay, maybe the stakes were a bit higher because that was on live TV, unlike a seminar which is behind closed doors. Mm-hmm. But this was something that I was used to. Now, you mentioned that the phrase headline grabbing, and often results and often papers can be headline grabbing because they say stuff that people want to be true. So if I was to have a headline that diversity improves financial performance, or that sustainability leads to a company becoming more successful, that is headline grabbing because people think they want it to be true, and so they're not going to question it. Whereas mine was perhaps headline grabbing, but not for the same reason. It was actually headline grabbing because it's counterintuitive. Because you might wonder, how could something as rational and dispassionate as the stock market be affected by something as crazy and wacky as football? And so there, actually, it was even more important to be rigorous. Right? Many people will not challenge you if you claim that diversity improves financial performance because they want that to be true. That people will challenge you if you claim that football results affect the stock market. And so this is why we needed to make sure that we had absolutely nailed that result before we went public.
So I want to tie this back to may contain lies. But first of all, where did the inspiration to write this particular book come from?
My day job is to write academic papers and publish them in academic journals. But unlike most other academics, I'm not just content with just writing academic papers. I actually want to ensure that they affect the way that people think and act in the real world. So I spend a lot of time disseminating the findings of academic research to practitioners. And notice it's not just my own research that I'm trying to plug, but the research of other scholars in the academic community. And what I found was that people's reaction to the research depended almost entirely on whether they liked its findings. So if they liked the conclusions of the research, they claimed it was the world's best paper. And if they didn't like the research, they'd say, oh, this is just academic research. It has no relevance for the real world. And so what this led me to believe is that confirmation bias was rife. So how people responded to research depended on its appeal, not its accuracy. So I wanted to write a book highlighting just how dangerous these biases are, that they can cause us to fall for papers which are flimsy. And then as a practical step, how can we notice misinformation and simple questions that we can ask ourselves, even if we're a time-pressed, busy practitioner without the time to look up every single reference. And even if we don't have a PhD in statistics, there is not a single equation in the whole book. I wanted it to be a useful, practical guide for how the reader can combat misinformation.
Why these two biases? Confirmation bias and black and white thinking. There are 300, I don't know how many cognitive biases now out in the world, but why these two? Why zero in on these two in particular?
Yeah, so the book starts by talking about two biases which lead people to be misinformed. And so the first is confirmation bias. So this is the idea that we have a view of the world and we will latch on to anything that confirms that view and reject something that contradicts that. For example, we might have strong beliefs about climate change, about immigration, about gun control, about abortion, and therefore we will lap up anything which supports our viewpoint. However, there might be many things about which we have no strong view, and this is where a second bias comes in, which is black and white thinking, which is we might not know which way something goes. We're completely open-minded to thinking it's either good or bad, but if we view the world in black and white terms, we think it must be either always bad or always good, and therefore we are more likely to lap up something with an extreme conclusion. So let me make this concrete with an example. Mm-hmm. So let's take diet. So most people do have existing views about protein. So we learn in school that protein builds muscle. We also have a view about fat. We think fat must be bad. It's called fat because it makes you fat. But something like carbs might not be so clear cut. And so the Atkins diet would play on black and white thinking by highlighting that and by claiming that carbs are always bad. He said to lose weight, just minimize carbs, just completely cut them out. And notice he said cut out all carbs. He didn't say simple carbs are bad, like refined sugars, but complex carbs like starches are good. He said all carbs are bad, and that made it easy to implement. All you need to do is to look at the carbs label on a nutritional information and decide whether to eat it or not. But notice that he could have had the same impact and gone equally viable had he had the opposite result and claimed that carbs were always good. Because again, that would be a simple message which is easy to implement. So to pen a bestseller and to go viral, Atkins did not need to be right. He just needed to be extreme.
I think one of the things I quite like about the way you start the book, there's these two biases, and I think we spend way too much time, or people in this space, identifying new ones, right? And that's not necessarily always helpful. What is helpful is some of the things that you, I think, outline in your solutions, or some of the problems, etc. But yeah, just curious why these two? What do you say when someone says, well, what about, I don't know, optimism bias, or why not something else that we commonly hear about?
It's for the reasons that I've just explained. So confirmation bias applies when you have an existing view, and black and white thinking applies when you don't have an existing view. So the combination of the two applies to almost all cases in which we are responding to information.
Okay. I want to dive into some of the problems associated with the way in which around may contain lies, and we've touched on a little bit of that. But when you read the problems that you've got, one is that's quite interesting. If we talk about data is not evidence, there's data mining. Now, I've worked in the world of management consulting, and when I read that chapter, I thought, oh my God. That's what I've seen done quite a lot, is data mining. Could you talk a little bit more about what data mining is, and why it's sometimes so tricky to actually spot?
Absolutely. So data mining is the idea that you mine the data in order to give a result that people want. So rather than starting from a blank sheet of paper and just seeing what the data says, you start with the conclusion and then you reverse engineer the data to give that conclusion. So let's first start with consulting or investment banking, which was the career that I was in. So often the client knows what decision they want to take, and they might hire a consultant just to reverse engineer an analysis to justify that decision. Why? Because then they can take the analysis to the board, or they can explain this to the general workforce and say, hey, we are cutting down, we are downsizing the workforce, but don't blame us, blame the consultant. The consultant came up with the analysis saying that we should cut 10% of our workforce. And similarly for investment banking, you might think an investment banker should advise a client how much to pay in a deal. But sometimes it might be the client says, I want to pay $60 per share, come up with analysis that supports them. So that is data mining in an advisory context, be this consulting or investment banking. Let's now look at data mining in terms of studies and research. So here, the client is often the general public. Right? If you produce research, in order for this to go viral, this must be research that people are wanting to be true, because then they'll share it. And so let's say people want to believe that diversity improves firm performance. Now, ironically, it was a management consultancy, McKinsey, which might have experience in data mining for its clients that also data mined these studies on diversity. Now, there's lots of different ways that you could measure diversity. You might say it's the number of women on the board, 3 or more versus 2 or fewer, or maybe 4 or more versus 3 or fewer, or 5 or more versus 4 or fewer. Or maybe it's not just an absolute level, but a relative level, say more than 50%, or more than a third, or more than a quarter. And there's loads of different ways that you can measure financial performance. You can look at total shareholder return. You can look at sales growth. You can look at profit margin. You can look at return on equity or return on sales or return on assets. So there's probably maybe 50 different combinations that they could have run. And maybe they ran all 50 and 49 of them failed. And then 1 of them worked. And they would just publish that one result. And this is robust. Now, often when people think about misinformation, they think misinformation is faking the data. But the data that they're presenting is 100% accurate. So they can't get prosecuted for this because they haven't committed any fraud. All they've done is hidden the stuff that did not work. And this is why it's difficult to detect, but it's not impossible. So some accounting professors, Jeremiah Green and John Hand, what they did was they ran every single permutation that McKinsey could have run. And they found that in all other permutations, you did not get the result. But only in the permutation that they did present was there the possibility of a result. So that suggested that they were running lots of results and only showing what supported the result that they wanted to see.
If you're an executive and you're receiving information like this, or you're working in an organization and you're using information from some of these studies or internal research or things of that nature, what are some of the ways in which we can have better conversations in the workplace when we're presented with data and maybe spot or ask reasonably logical questions around, say, data mining? How could we maybe employ a few techniques to spot when something may not be as it, the conclusions may be false or not based on the data that's being presented?
Specifically on the context of data mining, what you can do is you can ask, well, are the things that you're trying to measure being measured in the most plausible way? For example, BlackRock did their own study on diversity, and they showed that diversity is linked to return on assets. But BlackRock is an investor. And how investors are evaluated is their total shareholder return. So when you look at a BlackRock fund, they will always advertise the total return on that fund, which is not the same as return on assets. You can have a company with low return on assets, but high shareholder return. Some tech companies in the US aren't making any profit, but have huge returns because of their future prospects. So that is just not a plausible way of measuring performance to begin with. And similarly, what is the variable that you're correlating with performance if you're trying to look at the effect of mood on the stock market? Is really lunar cycles or clock changes the one thing that you look at? Does that really affect your mood? Whereas anybody who's a sports fan will know that sports results have a huge effect on your mood. So you want to ask, well, are these things being measured in the most plausible way? And if there's other ways to measure them, ask, has the study checked for robustness? Do the results continue to hold when you measure it in a different manner? So that's one reason why data is not evidence. Even if something is completely accurate, even if what you see is true, it might be misleading. But another reason is the difference between correlation and causation. Now, any listener might think, I know correlation is not causation. But even if you know this, unfortunately, many people forget this when they like this result being paraded. So let's take the link between sustainability and performance, which I really want to be true because a lot of my work is on the benefits of sustainability. Now, there's many studies, again, by the likes of McKinsey, touting that more sustainable companies will be better. But is this sustainability leads to better performance? Or is it performance leads to sustainability? Once the company is already doing well, then it can invest in improving sustainability. Or maybe there are third factors that affect both. Maybe a company with a great CEO, that great CEO improves the sustainability of her company, and that great CEO independently improves performance rather than one causing.
Could we just touch on the sustainability piece a little bit? Because I know you've done work in this space, and I've read one of your articles about the end. You call it the end of ESG, or the ESG is nothing special. And one of the quotes I quite like is the current practice of ESG reduces complex issues into boxes that must be. But I think thinking about my listeners, thinking about myself as well, and thinking what you've just said there, it does gnaw at us a little bit, because there's we want something that we want to be true. I think a lot of people working in big corporates want to think that they are doing something, right for the world. And therefore I presume then that can lead to confirmation bias. But, there's a nuance to this, right? That there are trade-offs, and there are instances in which doing something that's quote unquote sustainable does provide certain benefits, but it's not black and white. And I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit of your work in this space, because the corollary is not what you're saying either, right? That this stuff doesn't make any difference. It's not black and white. So I'm wondering if maybe we could just dive into the world of ESG and sustainability. And I know that those terms are different, but if we could just maybe talk a little bit about that, maybe also use that as an example of how to cut through some of this black and white thinking, that might be useful.
So one of my first studies was looking at the link between employee satisfaction and long-term firm performance. And what I found was that companies that treat their workers well, as measured by inclusion on the Fortune list of the 100 best companies to work for in America, these deliver higher shareholder returns over a 28-year period. And I did further analyses to suggest that it was employee satisfaction that leads to better financial performance, rather than better financial performance leading to employee satisfaction, or other factors like industry affecting both employee satisfaction and financial performance. So that was an initial paper which people interpreted as an ESG paper. But then there were claims that anything called ESG improves financial performance, be this Catholic values or climate change or biodiversity, or just general board diversity. And this is not necessarily the case, because ESG comprises lots of different things. And even if employee satisfaction improves financial performance, this doesn't mean that the other things will also improve financial performance. This is an application of the black and white thinking that we mentioned earlier. If you view the world in black and white terms, then anything called ESG is either always good, or anything called ESG is always bad, when some things might be good and other things might not be. It's just like saying, is food good for you? Well, broccoli might be good for you, and ice cream might be bad for you. We can't lump all things under the same brush. But why do people have this tendency to have black and white thinking? Is it just makes things easy. But you can buy a fund called ESG, thinking that anything that they do must be good and it's going to improve financial performance, when actually there's many different flavors of ESG investing. If you focus on employee satisfaction, that may well improve financial returns, because there's strong business logic for why treating your workers well will be good for your company in the long term. But other things such as Catholic values or excluding fossil fuels, that might not necessarily improve your financial returns. Absolutely, fossil fuels are bad for wider society. And I think climate change is a really important, serious issue. However, right now, we don't yet have enough government action against climate change. So carbon emissions are an externality where companies are able to emit carbon and they're not suffering the consequences. Not even in the long term. If you take decades of data, you find that the emitting companies are not suffering, even though we've known about climate change, certainly from when I was at school a couple of decades ago. So even if climate change is really bad for society, it is not bad for the companies that are emitting it. So the idea that doing bad for the world always is bad for your company is not borne out by the data.
Mm-hmm. And so if you are an organization trying to maybe cut through this and make an investment decision, for example, and you've got some goals. Maybe I've heard you talk about purpose before, purpose statements, and you've got some objectives that might be at odds with one another. Maybe you've said something about committing to to net zero, or something that might seem a bit hyperbolic, but you've got short-term quarterly numbers to make. How would an organization maybe cut through, funding a new initiative? Let's say it's an energy company, looking at a new, LNG project, or anything really that is going to have some complexity in it, because there's going to be potentially some trade-offs and some difficult questions to navigate. How would you advise an organization like that to maybe think through a decision, taking into account some of the problems in may contain lies, and some of the satisfying maybe multiple objectives?
It's just as easy as highlighting what the different trade-offs are. I often get this question, which is, how can a company make a decision when there's different trade-offs? Throughout life, we always make decisions with trade-offs, right? How do you decide which job to take? Well, some jobs have a higher salary than others, but they might have sort of more demanding work or longer hours, or it might be that you like the people more at one place rather than another. But we're able to make this decision without analysis paralysis. How do you decide which house to buy? Well, one house might be cheaper, but it might be in a worse location. So I often get this question because executives think, well, unless they can reduce everything to one single number, which captures everything about a project, both its financial returns and its social impact, they can't make the decision. But I think this is just not feasible, and it's not even necessary. We are able to make decisions when there's multiple criteria. I think the goal here is just to be aware of the different criteria, rather than trying to reduce this complexity into one single criterion, which would be the black and white thinking approach.
Yeah, it sounds fairly straightforward. It's harder to do, but I think your book makes a good contribution to this, because I think we often don't think, when we say, for example, evidence is not proof, when we say something like that, it's good conversations where we're trying to sort through things, and even just in our personal lives as well. We run into these problems a fair bit. So I think your book makes a really good contribution around spotting some of these things. I think the practice is the harder part. These are skills that we need to embed in ourselves and in the organizations within which we work. And perhaps we could just move into some of the things that you propose, some of the solutions, and maybe we start with thinking smarter as individuals. And, how can we start to just tune into some of these traps a little bit more, and maybe practice a few things to spot some of the problems, make better. What are some of the ways in which, just as individuals, we could just become more effective?
I think it starts by being aware of your biases. And so if you're aware that you have a strong view about a particular topic, then if you see something which confirms that view, actually challenge it rather than accepting it uncritically. And so one thing that you might do is you might imagine if it had found the opposite result. How would you try to attack it? So let's say we found that sustainability is associated with worse financial performance. We wouldn't like that, and we would try to attack it. We might say, well, how did they truly measure sustainability? And did they only look at short-term performance, because sustainability is all about the long term? So now that we've highlighted the possibility of holes in the study, even if the study finds the result that we do want, which is sustainability leads to higher performance, ask ourselves, do the same challenges apply? For example, there was a paper in the Harvard Business Review which claims that sustainability must pay off because during the start of the COVID pandemic, between February and March 2020, companies which were perceived as being more sustainable did better. Massive holes in that. First, it was looking at a 4-week period. Right, that's far too short to make inferences. If anybody had claimed that sustainability underperformed over a 4-week period, people would have said, well, you can't look at just 4 weeks. And so even though the result is in the direction that we want, we should still be equally critical about that 4-week short period. And second, to measure sustainability by companies that the public thought were acting sustainably, that is not rigorous, because it could be that these companies are greenwashing. How do we know that the public is actually good at evaluating sustainability rather than actual delivery of sustainability? Again, you would be critical of measuring sustainability in that way if sustainability found the result that you didn't want. And so you should be equally critical even though the study finds the result that you do.
In that Harvard Business Review study, I can just imagine the conversation, because someone said, well, this is Harvard Business Review, right? This, what you know, do you want to dissect and peer review an HBR article that must have gone through some sort of rigorous process?
And you should do, because Harvard Business Review is not a rigorous process at all. I publish a lot in Harvard Business Review, so I have no incentive to tear them down. But Harvard Business Review has sort of this great brand, but it is not a peer review journal. Right, it's just a magazine, just like any other magazine. Any magazine which sells articles will have articles which confirm what people want to be true. So there's no peer review like you would have in a scientific journal, where leading experts in that field will advise on whether the paper is correct or not. It's just the editor who decides. And the editor of Harvard Business Review might be just like the editor of the Wall Street Journal or New York Times. Those are great publications, and I read them, but they have a viewpoint and they want to deliver what the readership wants. And this is the same problem with McKinsey. People say, well, why do we ever challenge a McKinsey study on diversity? Because McKinsey is great. But McKinsey is a consultancy. It is not a scientific organization trying to conduct scientific research. And similarly, Harvard Business Review, I would see in the same light as Wall Street Journal or New York Times, very respected source of information. I do read it, but I would not treat this in the same way that I would treat, say, Nature or the British Medical Journal.
Yeah, this part I find fascinating, because in a number of places, if you just throw out those names, HBR and McKinsey or whatever, the conversation sometimes stops, right? It just, presumably this must be true, rather than, what you're saying is, no, let's have a conversation. Let's look at this. And, I think it would be very powerful if more organizations did that. But sadly, it doesn't seem to, there's certain critical thinking skills that seem to be, I don't know if it's whether it's lacking or if it's time pressure or it's all the stuff that you talk about. So maybe that's an interesting way to segue into thinking about how organizations can think smarter. How we can have better conversations in organizations and in groups about things like this.
Yeah, so this is to try to encourage different viewpoints, because if we indeed are biased and will interpret something according to whether it confirms our beliefs, we want people with different beliefs from us. And so this is the idea of cognitive diversity. So notice that cognitive diversity is quite different from demographic diversity. So often companies think, well, we want to have a range of genders and ethnicities in an organization. And as an ethnic minority, I would love that to be true. But that is really reductive. This reduces the complexity of a person to just their gender and ethnicity. That suggests, well, let's bring women into the boardroom because there's a woman's way of thinking. There's an Asian way of thinking. So why don't they put me in the boardroom? But this is different. This is really crazy because there's different people think in different ways. They're not just a slave to their gender and ethnicity. That would suggest that a white male can never add diversity to an organization when maybe his background is in humanities and everybody else's background is in finance, or maybe he's from a different socioeconomic background. So this is to get people who truly think differently. So in chapter 10 of the book, I give the example of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that was dealt with by Kennedy's Executive Committee of the National Security Council, which, given it was 1960, comprised only of white men. So there was no demographic diversity, but there was a lot of cognitive diversity there because there were military leaders, but there were also people who were much more skeptical about military action. And that was the really important type of diversity there, was different views on the importance and the effectiveness of military action. Also, what's important is not just diversity, but also inclusion. So creating environments where people feel encouraged to speak up and share dissenting viewpoints. That is the opposite of groupthink, where often in large organizations, what is valued is being a team player, and often being a team player is equated with supporting whatever view is being paraded and not raising any dissenting viewpoints. I would view a team player as somebody who does something which is good for the team, and something which is good for the team is to highlight if you're headed for an iceberg straight ahead. But often many organizations just want yes men and yes women rather than people who truly are going to challenge and think.
How do organizations get better at that? I mean, the cognitive diversity is so incredibly valuable. How can organizations improve that?
Well, this is by actively trying to recruit people of different viewpoints, not just different genders, but different viewpoints, even though somebody of a different viewpoint might be challenging to you. So it might be that you're a strong Republican, but you want to have also Democrats on your senior management team, but also to be active about giving people the chance to challenge you. And again, this is difficult. Often senior leaders think, well, why am I senior? Yeah. It's because I'm great. I have all the answers, and anybody who challenges me must be wrong. But actually, you might want to recognize that despite your seniority, you do have blind spots, and you want to encourage people to highlight your blind spots.
I know that you mentioned some of this in the book, but I also think there's a number of benefits and something very powerful when organizations actively design dissent into decisions. So that might mean creating a group of people whose sole job is to poke holes in an initiative. For example, this sort of idea of red teaming, or you also, I think you mentioned the pre-mortem technique, but there are ways, there are very practical things that organizations can do to make sure that dissenting views, or potentially dissenting views, not necessarily, but views that may be unconventional, that they're given a bit more airtime. And I would argue the bigger the decision, the more the more organizations ought to actively do that.
Yeah, so this is what lots of companies will try to do, is to have devil's advocates for a decision, which is what's known as a red team. So when you have people who are there to try to highlight issues with the decision. So within the executive committee of the National Security Council, there was a set of military people who wanted to go ahead with military action. And there was a red team which was proposing a different action, which was a blockade and highlighting the dangers with military action. You asked at the start about whether Richard Quest grilling me on CNN was a concern to me. And I answered it wasn't. Why? Because the academic profession automatically has red teams and devil's advocates. So whenever you present a paper at a conference, before the conference, a discussant has been assigned to your paper. So he or she has been chosen to read your paper in advance. And then after your presentation, they give a 10 or so minute critique of the paper where they highlight its strengths, but they also highlight some potential issues and ways it can be done better. And then you, as the author, will respond to the critique afterwards. And often the responses are not defensive, but they are to say, oh, these are really good points. I'm going to work on improving the paper on this in these dimensions. So what I'd been what I'd been taught to do was to respond to critiques, not defensively, but constructively. And so when Richard Quest was grilling me, I did not mind that at all.
It's not that common in organizations, though, to take that you must have built that up over time. Would you say, or is it? or maybe not? Did you have that predisposition to welcome some challenge? Is that what maybe attracted you to academia in the first place? Or did you develop that over time?
The first school that I went to was a Montessori school, and the Montessori school system is one where they'll try to encourage people to challenge. So often you think that there is education is about intrusion. It's about rote learning and getting people to memorize the facts. But no, I was lucky that my school encouraged children to question, even though maybe as a 7-year-old child, I started when I was 7, you might think you have far less knowledge than the teacher. Actually here, even if you are somebody who's inexperienced, you might have interesting questions to ask. And we want to encourage those questions rather than to...
Even that process, when I was in school, just sometimes in a civics class or something along those lines, you're often put into positions where you need to argue both sides of an issue, or argue for something you fundamentally oppose. And those are great skills. Did you think that in danger of, across educational systems of not having that? Is critical thinking, and are these skills being taught as far as you can see? Or, I'm curious whether or not you're seeing something good or maybe not so good, with some of the students that are coming through. Have you looked at the educational system in say in the UK around critical thinking skills?
Yes, and I discussed this in chapter 11 of the book, is that often we don't have critical thinking. Why? Because what we want is rote learning. Because how do we assess whether you're a good teacher? You often get people to perform according to standardized tests. And certainly in the US, under, say, No Child Left Behind, this was just some rote memorization of disconnected facts rather than how to challenge. So I think, and when I go to chapter 11 of the book, this is about how to encourage smarter thinking, not just in it as individuals, which is chapter 9, or as organizations, which is chapter 10, but as societies. I think instilling critical thinking in education is absolutely critical. And you might think, well, is that feasible? Because don't we need to wait until somebody is 16 before they're taught statistical literacy? But as I highlight throughout the whole book, a lot of this is just discernment. Is not about statistical pyrotechnics. So to understand that there might be multiple explanations for a result, maybe it's correlation without causation. That is just like giving a kid a murder mystery and then realizing that the most likely suspect is often not the actual culprit. And that's something that kids learn from an early age. If you read murder mysteries, then you don't just look at the most obvious suspect. And if we think about that with data as well, that's something which I think is absolutely feasible for I'm
just conscious of time, but I'm wondering about how youth practice, how you think about some of these things. Is there what would keep you up at night about a piece of work that you did? Like, what would be a situation where, you got this wrong, or you've been accused of doing something that actually you recommend, you say not to do in the book, or something along those lines. And how do you
it's try to ensure that when you write papers that you always are challenging yourself. So there's a study that I've been working on for a while on sustainable investing, where it's taking us a very long time to actually produce the paper, because unless all 3 co-authors, all of which of us are pretty rigorous, unless we're absolutely sure that we're not making claims that are not fully supported by the data, we're not going to release it. And we often do a good job of shooting down each other's work by making sure that none of us is to add anything to the paper which is not fully supported. So to make sure that when you work on a team of co-authors, that everybody there is absolutely rigorous. Also, if you sometimes get something wrong, to acknowledge this. So about a month ago, I wrote a LinkedIn post about a paper. And this was a paper that I had handled at the Review of Finance, which was the academic journal that I was managing editor of. So I thought I remembered this paper because I accepted it about 8 months ago. but it took 8 months for it to come out because there's a delay between acceptance and the actual publisher publishing it. And then somebody commented that my description of the paper was a little bit inaccurate because I had not fully remembered the paper over the past 8 months. And one solution could be I just amend my initial description and then delete that comment as if I had already written it from the start. But no, I replied to the comment saying, thank you, I was wrong. I appreciate you pointing this out. I am still going to be editing my post because otherwise people might be misinformed and read the post without the comment highlighting my mistake, but I will still keep the comment and my mistake there to highlight that sometimes I get things wrong. And then if I do get things wrong, I do encourage people to challenge me and make comments to that point so that I can correct them.
It's very sensible. I certainly, I wish more leaders are like that. Often we see organizations and leaders make decisions, and then if the decision doesn't turn out that well, for a number of reasons, they might distance themselves from being part of it and so forth. We need far more of this type of honesty in organizations and in conversations. I just before we wrap up, I'm just curious as to how you select the topics that you look at, whether it's sustainability, football results, or financial performance. So where does that come from? Where do you get your ideas around what to maybe pursue a study?
So I think these are the things which will be just impactful. So I think these are things which will be interesting for a general audience. So sustainability is something that many people care about. A lot of talking heads are professing about, but often without research and expertise. So often in a topic like sustainability, which is polarized and politicized, I think, well, this is absolutely a topic which is crying out for research and a more level-headed view.
Okay. And what's on your list of interesting topics? Is there something around, I mean, AI is seemingly the topic to jour, but what sparks your curiosity these days?
Well, I'm certainly say what doesn't, and AI does not spark my curiosity in terms of
okay. All right. Good.
Why I think it's really
right,
but I have no expertise in it, and so this is the real problem: is that nowadays you have people professing on everything. So I just this morning read a review in the Wall Street Journal of Scott Galloway's book on personal financial advice. This guy is a marketing professor, and he's actually not a proper professor. He's like an adjunct professor, and he's now starting to write books on personal financial advice. And the book was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal by Professor James Choi of Yale University, who is a global expert on personal finance, and just highlights that lots of things in the book are actually just plain wrong, and the things that are not wrong are just obvious and known anyway. So I think what's really important is to write based on your expertise rather than just writing something which is topical. But the danger is, just like Wall Street Journal and Harvard Business Review, if somebody happens to be famous and have a name, even if it's a completely different field, then people are believing what they say. So why is Bill Gates now one of the world's experts on climate change? He is a tech entrepreneur, a brilliant one, but being an expert in tech is very different from being an expert in climate change.
That's a great answer. Thank you. Just conscious of time. We covered a lot of ground. Was there anything that you wanted to mention that you don't think we adequately covered?
No, just to reiterate that these things are important. So yes, I'm a finance professor and I go through life reading academic papers, but even if you're somebody who never reads a single academic paper, you're always encountering information, and whether to use what to believe and what not to believe is really important. And it's not something which is hugely complex that you need a PhD in statistics. You just need simple discernment to ask a couple of simple questions. And that's what my book tries to highlight in a simple and engaging way to busy practitioners who are not able to dig into the weeds of every story.
Fantastic. Alex, thank you very much for taking the time to chat. I really enjoyed this. Really appreciate you coming onto the show. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for having me on.